Hello. Thanks for tuning in. I'm really looking forward to this, to hearing everyone's response and sharing this video, which I'll talk about in a second. So I just want to do a few housekeeping things. So if you've been thinking about doing the art of circling, which is a year-long training in the art of facilitating and tuning in the ways that some of the ways that you see here in the videos. It's a year-long training. You have about a week and a half before it starts. So let me know if you want to talk about that. Send me an email. My email's below. Also, if I have like maybe one more space open to work with clients one-on-one. So I do deep consulting and coaching work, working with people one-on-one. So if you're interested in that, email me. And I think that's it for the housekeeping. So today's video, I have such a rich dialogos with John Vervaeke and Johannes. You're probably pretty familiar with John Vervaeke from my channel. Johannes is, you may be less familiar. I have a couple of videos with him already up from a while back. To me, Johannes is, he is a true Heideggerian in the Heideggerian sense. There's a way where I can really get this sense with Johannes that he embodies, evokes, has been transformed by the spirit of thinking in the deepest sense of the word. So I'm really excited to bring him into the conversation in the dialogos, and of course John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive scientist and philosopher and professor that's been doing work on the meaning crisis. And we came together to bring in dialogue specifically with the intention of looking at the history of the understanding of being in metaphysics, which includes nihilism, and to get into conversation with the notion of John Vervaeke's The Meaning Crisis. I wanted to get those two, I got this together because I wanted to get those two things talking together because they're so intimate for me. So I wanted to like really let those dialogue together. And of course, they did, and it led to levels of understanding and ideas that I'm sure are going to be accompanying me in all the walks that I take and all the people that I talk to that live in me. That's one of the things about this sense of dialogos, is that on one level, it's like it's happening in the conversation, but then it keeps happening, right? In my dreams, in the way that I see, what I think about, the tensions I hold. It's an ongoing thing that I find that I live in, right? And this conversation definitely had that sensibility about it. So I'm continually grateful that I get to have a life and I get to do these things with these extraordinarily beautiful people. And so thanks for tuning in. I look forward to hearing your comments, and enjoy.
So it's good to see the two of you again.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Guy, for inviting me to that video drop-in session on Sunday. That was quite wonderful. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, drop-in. I just appreciated you making the time, and drop-in felt, you seem particularly dropped in. I don't know exactly how to put it, but just a sense of like you just were bonk. I appreciated it.
There was a lot of good questions from that group. A lot of good questions.
Yeah, it's a good group.
Yeah,
it's a good group.
Well, I appreciate them watching the series.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought maybe we could follow up on the discussion that Johannes and I had on Heidegger and the questions around science, technology, and spirituality. I think that would be a good place to pick up. But Guy, we could also weave it together with perhaps the Dialogos project, broadly construed, because I think those two should be brought into a deeper conversation with each other.
Right.
And so I think that would be a good place to pick up and sort of weave together. What do you guys think about that as a proposal for going forward?
That sounds great. I could share too, just some of my thoughts about like kind of tensions or questions that I've been walking around with is a couple of things. Like one is I would like to get Heidegger's notion, right, about the technological age and the history of being and the history, precisely the history of metaphysics, in conversation with them in nihilism and in conversation with the meaning crisis.
Yes, very much. Very much.
Seeing, because in my mind, on one level, I think about it, and I'm like, I don't know if I actually have if there's a difference there, but I'm imagining there's some key differences, right? But I would love to get them talking to each other, and I would imagine they would deeply inform one another in ways that would be really compelling.
I think that's really good. Yeah. I think Johannes and I, we didn't finish. I don't think we actually got around to the topic of Heidegger's thesis that the history of metaphysics is the history of nihilism. I think we were just sort of broaching on it. Am I remembering that correctly? I think that's about where we were, and we're just about to get onto that. Yeah. And of course, the connection to the meaning crisis, I think, is pertinent and relevant. Mm-hmm. I start off the whole section on the prophets of the meaning crisis with Heidegger, because I think he's a pivotal figure. I would like to talk about that, and that goes towards sort of the broader topic that I'm trying to explore, in the new series I have, Voices with Vervaeke, because I'm trying to get at this relationship between science, spirituality, and the meaning crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's one, is getting those two talking to each other. The other one is just kind of a tension I notice I'm having that's just come about, and it's I was really one of the things, Johannes, I really enjoyed your conversation with your last conversation with your teacher about nihilism.
With Ivo De Gennaro.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excuse me. What was the name?
Ivo De Gennaro.
Yeah. Yeah. I just really enjoy him a lot. Like just his rigor of thought, but his fluidity at the same time. Just a real unique being. But one of the things he talked about was how do we, how do we respond to the withdrawal of being, right? And how do you respond to that? And I think one of the things I notice I have a wondering or a tension when I listen to other people and when I think about it myself is, on one level, I see a lot of people so-called responding to it, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? However, it seems to me that in some way, the way that they're thinking about it demonstrates embodies the in their response, like furthers the issue of technology, right? Kind of like this notion of like turning the world into a problem to solve, right? And I just noticed, like, I think I have this sense of what Heidegger's talking about with temporality and like the understanding of being, is that it's actually, we are inside of it, right? Right? There's a quality of like that it's not under our direct control, and like that there's something in there about and given that, right, what is the authentic response, being immortal, right, and being in touch with the actual phenomena. So that's like one of the things that I'm noticing is, and just also thinking about it in terms of like the ecology of practices, right? Mm-hmm. Right. And your John, your my understanding of your repeated insistence that not to imply an ontotheology, right?
Yes.
Like it's about the process of exercising the machinery, right? And like we don't need to assert a being, right, or a God or something, but there's a mystery and a touchness that you can get in it through the exercise of it, right? And I think there's like deep parallels there, but I just get irritated with people a lot when they talk about like this kind of mania of like, it's up to us to fix the world or something like that, you know? And there's a tension in there for me.
So, I mean, that might allow me to a couple issues I want to frame, and then maybe we'll let Johannes any issues he wants to frame. So in connection with your second point, I'm interested in putting into a more clear and clarifying discussion relationship what the ontological aspects, the existential and the psychological aspects of the meaning crisis are. And because in connection with that, Chris and I have been working on an article for the Side View on the symptomology of the meaning crisis and trying to develop that. And as you know, you probably know, I think you've seen this before, we distinguish between sort of reactive responses and reflective responses. And I think for the project that we're trying to do, I think that's adequate. But that pretty much sits at sort of the intersection, and it needs to be teased out better between the cognitive and the existential, but it doesn't get too much into the ontological. And I'd like to get that a little bit clearer. And that might be a way of going back to the first point of clarifying the relationship between the meaning crisis and nihilism. And then the other point that came up was, which is a point that Johannes and I did talk about quite a bit, which is, you know, I'm struggling for a verb here because it's not quite adequate, but something like the reconceptualization, but in a very profound way, of sacredness. And what does that mean for us now? And what relationship does that have? To my first question, is sacredness a category, for example, that cuts across the cognitive, the existential, and the ontological? Is that precisely what it's supposed to do for us? And therefore trying to situate it within any one of those categories is a mistake. But if it is trans-categorical like that, then what's our appropriate way of understanding and relating to it? So those are the two issues I'd like to sort of try and get clearer about.
And just one other thing in there that's just the paper that you and Chris wrote.
Yeah,
is so good. So good. Like, Chris and I we're gonna actually start off our series of videos where we go through the Platonic dialogues with paper, because I think it frames it perfectly and grounds it in, you know, in our time. And but the way you formulated, there's a way that you formulated the problem, which I just thought was, I've just been thinking about it ever since, which is the loss of the second person, like postmodernity as the loss of the other, basically.
Yeah, and in a particular kind of way. Yes, yeah, I think that's right.
I'd never thought about it quite like that, but there's something about just that sense of where we're blind, right, to what presupposes what gives a genuine dialogos, right? And right?
I think that goes towards both my questions. I mean, no surprise, because, you know, I'm posing the question and I wrote the paper with Chris. So, but the idea that dialogos might actually again cut across the three categories, and it might be a place in which we're also finding a way of reenacting and therefore reimagining, in Corban's sense of the word imagine, the imaginal, reimagining the sacred. And so I would like to talk about that in connection to the two questions I raised.
Yeah, let me just briefly maybe summarize what Di Gennaro and I talked about. So we know that something else. It was on Nietzsche and Heidegger on the definitions of nihilism. And for Nietzsche, nihilism is that beings are nothing. beings are senseless, they amount to nothing, while, and that for Heidegger means that Nietzsche here turns all of metaphysics on its head, but is still a metaphysician. Why? Because he begins with beings and then leaps to the beingness of beings. And then Heidegger in the second Nietzsche book writes or argues that authentic nihilism, eigentlicher Nihilismus, would mean not meaninglessness in this sense that we usually, how we usually think of it, but would mean that being itself always already stays away. Being itself amounts to nothing. And that's not a value judgment, that's not a moral problem, but being is always already withdrawing. And what metaphysics has, perhaps you could say, failed to see or failed to understand, is that being itself is that which withdraws, self-conceals, self-denies itself, and has instead posited the beingness of beings, right? Has reified being, for example, as a, to come back to what you mentioned, John, the ontotheology, posits being as the causa sui, that means the ground that causes itself, and tries to give ultimate grounds. And here we have, as Heidegger also says, the connection to the sciences, which try to give a ground for all beings, whereas what we perhaps in exercise can learn or should learn is that ground always withdraws, that it's temporal, it's historical. So those are just a couple of thoughts maybe to begin with.
So one connection maybe we can pick up, we don't have to do it immediately on that, is I'm interested in Nishitani's take on that, because in Religion and Nothingness, he enters into a long sort of reflection on that, and he makes the argument that Asian, particularly Buddhist philosophy, has an advantage because it doesn't have an established history of prioritizing being over non-being and prioritizing actuality over possibility. And that, in fact, in Taoism and Buddhism, you see the inverse actually. And he argues that it's that kind of ability to stand on the inversion point between the two metaphysics. He talks about the pivot point, and that's where you're trying to get in your thinking, right? And so you can pivot between these two, and you can get to this place where you do this sort of fundamental aspect shift so you're not changing, if this is the right word, I don't even know if it's the right word, I seriously don't even know if it's the right word, but you're not changing the fact of nihilism, you're doing this sort of fundamental aspect shift on it. And you're going from seeing it as some kind of deep privation to seeing it as some kind of deep affordance. So I think that I'd like to pick up on that too, because I didn't ever get a chance to talk about the Kyoto School in the series, and it's really interesting because I think they're doing some. Well, I particularly think Nishitani's work is brilliant.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah, and so Heidegger in Being and Time says possibility stands higher than actuality. Right? Möglichkeit ist höher als Wirklichkeit. This is the total. That's an inversion of the history of metaphysics. For Hegel, it's still perfectly clear actuality is higher than possibility and actually consumes all of possibility. And that's simply a dialectical version of Aristotelianism, of Aristotelian logic, syllogism. And then Heidegger inverts this. And Heidegger, the Kyoto School, of course, originates because they go to Freiburg and listen to Heidegger. And, oh, wow, this is all of a sudden someone we can actually also understand.
Right.
And then, there's Heidegger is in touch with Japanese scholars throughout his life, and there's the text, a dialogue published that he synthesized from conversations he had over his lifetime with scholars from Japan, where he says we do live in different houses because we live in different languages, but there is still a neighborhood. It wouldn't make sense to speak of a house without, a house is only a house if it's a neighborhood with its surroundings, its landscape, another house, another village somewhere else. And there must be, and I think this is why Heidegger also gives up even on the word of philosophy, right? He says philosophy is over. It's the end. It's come to an end. Now thinking must break free. And I think this is this kind of, because European philosophy never had to deal, what we call metaphysics didn't have to deal with Japanese thought. It didn't have to deal with Indian thought much, right? It was circling around itself and blah, blah, absolute spirit, come, let me be your prophet. But now it has to deal with it, and Heidegger breaks free from this, and that's I think where we have to go is to have this dialogue between these different houses of being, if you like, these different planes of existence, because exactly as you say, if they don't consider what we call nihilism from a moral perspective, right? We say, oh no, this is dangerous, don't go there, don't go towards the nothing. But for someone like Heidegger and for the Kyoto school, you begin with nothing. You have to accept this withdrawal, this denial, concealment, however you refer to it. And only then, all of us, weirdly enough, beings light up again in their wealth, because they're no longer attacked as standing reserve, for example. Notion. That's a way of thinking of beings as, in terms of a beingness of beings, as something waiting to be explored.
It's connected to thinking of beings only insofar as they act. I'm picking up on this, on the key of actuality is, you know, how things act, right? Yeah. Which is different, right, from how they are, in the sense of both the phenomena they shine into, but they, as you said, they're also withdrawing at the same time.
And this is what I think even Aristotle shies away from this, because dynamis, which is the word, so dynamis is potentiality in Greek. We get the word dynamics from that in English. Dynamis carries with itself nothingness, because it's not yet actualized, and what is not yet actualized is, of course, there's the nothing, or some version of it lingering there. But that's something the West, or Western thought, or Western philosophy, metaphysics, etc., has been scared of, has been shied away from.
As both of you know, I'm a deep fan of Neoplatonism, but this is one area in which I have a deep criticism of Neoplatonism. And Nishitani makes it, of course, in the nothingness, because you see, for example, in Plotinus, that potentiality becomes equated with evil, explicitly. Now that had an important cultural, even ontological function, because it gave a locus for evil, and therefore rendered it, in some sense, metaphysically intelligible, right? Even saying that it's a place of non-intelligibility only makes sense if you can situate it within a field of intelligibility, right? And so I get why that was an attractive idea, right? I see why that's a very attractive idea, why people would adhere to it. But I think what I'm saying is, I think it's convergent with your point, is it permanently besmirched, potentiality, with the taint of the chaotic and the evil and the demonic, and that's why it's very hard. Like when I'm even trying to teach dynamical systems, and which is directly related to dynamics, to people, and I try to say, look, you have to shift, and I'll put a piece of chalk on a table and I'll push it, and I'll say, well, why did it move? And they'll say, well, because you pushed it. And I said, well, but why else did it move? Right? And they'll look at me, and they'll look at me. Well, you wanted it to move. And I said, no, not that. Why did it move? And there'll be a silence for a while, and then silence. And then when somebody will say, well, because there was like open space in front of it. And it's like, so, but why are you so fixated on the event? Why can't you see the constraints that make things possible, as opposed to the events that are making things act, right? So we even just trying to teach them something, this is not pure philosophy. This is just trying to get them to understand dynamical systems. I have to do this metaphysical move at the beginning of the class of getting them to break away from regarding actuality as a synonym for reality, and just getting them to break that in their mind. And then it takes them some time to do it, but once they do it, I can see this sort of and then you see all these, and then they realize all the possibilities for addressing a lot of sort of really tricky, thorny problems are now have a space in which you can address them that you couldn't address them before. But I'm only pointing out to this because it's just how pervasive this way of thinking is, and that's why, like when I read Religion and Nothingness for the first time, it just sort of it really blew my mind, because I got Heidegger's idea about that Nietzsche just inverts, but I needed something like Nishitani to say, but what's different from just the inversion? What's the trans framing, to use one of my terms, of this look like? And Nishitani gave me a sort of my first deep understanding of what that might look like.
Yeah, totally. And that sense of, what that exercise that you just said so much demonstrates, I think is the thing that Heidegger is getting at, which is about this whole techno inframing movement, where it's almost like this time it figurizes everything, right? So like the moment the ground, right, or background, it just keeps figuring it. Like it's only valid if it's positionable, right, locatable, and that's the thing that's just really, I think I keep finding myself impressed with that sense of, that there's an intelligibility, right? There is an understanding that I'm inside of, right, that organizes everything, such that I don't, it's not even personal. It's something that's constituting and how things make sense, right? And so that motion where that just that there's that issue where it's like, well, why do you always just figure the events? And you just have to sit with them to be able to see that there's a ground that allows for this, that withdrawals that you can't figure, right? That is very much.
Well, can we pick up on that, because that goes towards was it my first question? Like that understanding you're talking about, Guy. This is what I want to sort of slow down on and try and zoom in on, because that's what I'm trying to get at about something that's transcategorical, that somehow encompasses. It's not orthogonal to, but it's not reducible to any one of these categories. It's not reducible to the cognitive or the existential or the ontological. And I suggested to you that maybe sacredness is like that. And I think it sounds to me, let me speak very clearly, carefully. It sounds to me like you're trying to point to a kind of understanding, a kind of comportment to that kind of transcategorical sacredness. And I think that if we could unpack that together, I think that would be very helpful, because I think that goes towards this issue about, what the meaning crisis is and how I agree that we shouldn't identify the meaning crisis with nihilism. I think nihilism is a perennial aspect. There's a certain sense in which it is now, maybe to use your term, Guy, it's more foregrounded and more figured for people. And I would, but I still don't even want to equate that exactly with the meaning crisis. I would say something like nihilism is an aspect of the meaning crisis, because when I'm pointing to the meaning crisis, I'm trying to point to not just a kind of, what's the word, like an event, or right. I'm trying to point to, right. Also, well, I'm trying to point to all three of these categories. I'm trying to point to the psychological aspects. I'm trying to point to also the suffering, the loss of agency, the distress, right? I'm not just pointing to a particular realization, if that's the right word, about our relationship to being. I'm trying to point out that this erodes into certain fundamental aspects of how we try to fundamentally make sense and adopt agency in the world. So I think for me, it's a larger category than just what is encompassed by nihilism, in both the popular sense and also I think the more profound sense that we're talking about when we're talking about sort of the Kyoto school.
So the meaning crisis then is something distinctly modern. It's something distinctly of this epoch.
I think so. Although I would want to say that there was something deeply analogous to it in the Hellenistic period. That you had something like that, in which there was, pervasive sense of disconnection, of a loss of touch with realness, and this is where the whole metaphor of the philosopher as the physician of the psyche comes into prominence, right? And it's actually the progenitor of most of our cognitive therapies today. It comes out of that particular meaning crisis. And what was interesting was the culture was able to sort of reconfigure philosophy and what it meant, and then that had impacts on religion that sort of seemed to have alleviated a lot of the suffering and the distress. Whereas we seem to be in a place that's worse off, if I can put it that way, because of our disconnection from our wisdom traditions, we don't seem to have access to the resources we need in order to bring about the transformations that are really analogous to what happened in the Hellenistic period. So in one sense, yes, but I mean, see, that's how I'd answer that question.
Yeah, this just maybe a broader point, but this maybe makes it more accessible. What it is that Heidegger means when he speaks of the Seinsvergessenheit, of the oblivion of forgetting of being. It's this being cut off from what you would say these resources of wisdom.
Yes,
that we're now being totally divided from, and so we try to make sense by accelerating, right, or seeing ourselves as workers, or giving ourselves meaning. But the trouble, Kierkegaard says, if we just give meaning to ourselves or to something, we can throw away that meaning the next day. So there must be something deeper. It can't just be posited by us, which is the postmodern subjectivity that tries to get that done, but that totally doesn't work. There's paranoia that maybe kicks in too with late modern subjectivity now. And this sense of being cut off, I think, is what perhaps even what depression indicates or so, right? Sometimes
well, I was going to say, I mean, here's the clear instance of where, you know, the existential mode, the way, okay, so there's an ontological thing, there's our relationship to being, and then we get our existential mode, right? Obviously picked up on by Kierkegaard, but then you see it connecting to psychological factors, because I mean, the cognitive science on meaning says that one of the biggest, so we tend to emphasize, our culture likes to say that, in fact, we'll use this as a synonym, and it also shows, again, this collapse into actuality that we've been talking about, right? That my life is meaningful if I have a purpose, and it's this, right? It's the purpose, right? Now, having a sense of purpose, in fact, does psychologically contribute to meaning in life, but not as much as a sense of mattering, which is a sense of being connected to something that is larger than yourself, that has a value independent of your egocentric desires, right? And so it basically what it does, to put it into a phrase, and this then takes it back into Kierkegaard, you'll see why in a sec, it challenges you to aspire to transformation, right? Because the only way of appropriately relating, the only way of connecting to something that you accept is larger than yourself is through some kind of transformation, some kind of self-transcendence, right? And so that mattering to people is actually psychologically crucial, but it takes you into this existential project of the aspiration to self-transcendence. And then that puts you back into the ontological problem of what the heck does self-transcendence mean in our ontology? So that's what I mean about how I see all three connected. Maybe that's a good sort of case study of exactly what I'm trying to talk about here.
It is, yes.
I'm enjoying just, I love what you're possessed by, John.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do, I don't mean to be really overwhelming. I just like I'm actually feeling like I'm just a voice for the pregnancy of these connections speaking themselves, right? That like the way that the cognitive and the existential and the ontological are all, they're not identical. I'm not claiming that. I'm not doing a reduction here, but you see how they're interdependent, and therefore the problem, if that's the right word for it, what the issue that we're trying to address is not one that can simply be addressed by therapy or even by philosophy in the academic sense.
No. It must be back in the polis. It must be back in where philosophy always was strongest.
Yes.
It must be back in the, call it public sphere, whatever. But it needs to be, right, when you speak of this sense that I matter, but I matter because there's something else that matters more than just I. A true sense of awe, a sense of dangerous divinities. Something I like to think of. That you know, God isn't reason with a capital R, and we all bow down to our own magnificent powers. But there's something, what Heidegger keeps talking about, the uncanny, right? The uncanny of the world. And this is not a moral statement. This is to say there is something uncanny even just about existence. The sheer facticity of existence is uncanny. But that uncanniness is an invitation. that uncanniness is an invitation to think after what's actually going on. And that what's very important to me is memory. It's this shared, if you like, in English, I think, guess you could say something like a shared sense of memory that's larger than just my memory. Now I'm gonna be leaping around a bit now, so apologies for that. But when you think of how transhumanism, for example, tries to sell us immortality, which would mean that all our memories get shared in the cloud and that's a copy of yourself. That's probably not how I would think how memory works. I think that memory is much larger. It's shared as an extended self that you are thrown into, and you share in that a sense of memory that we are being cut off from because we are basically encapsulated, isolated, pinned down just on us, just me. And it's just my subjectivity that matters. I'm the ground of my world. Transformation is just about optimizing myself in order to get better, in order to achieve this and that. But it's never, or not often at least, getting back to a certain sense of understanding again what are the fundamental questions of, for example, existence. And if we do so, and that would have to accept, however, finitude and death, and also certain powerlessness, not an entire powerlessness, but to a certain degree of powerlessness in the face of existence itself.
So that's interesting. So there's two things I want to bring up on about that then. So a question is a relationship between Heidegger's sense of the uncanny and Otto's sense of the numinous, which Chris and I talk about quite a bit. They're both post-Kantian, so it's not completely irrelevant. And then what that has to do with, again, with this thing I'm talking about, the sacredness, because presumably the sacred would do exactly what I said. It would give you the psychological mattering that puts you into the correct existential mode of aspiration, right? That then also gave you a sense of an affordance of self-transcendence that wasn't just subjective projection, that was in some set had some kind of connectedness to reality to it. And so that's, again, helps me to sharpen that a little bit. And so what role does is the uncanny like the numinous, or are they just different ways of the same thing? And then what that has to do with collective memory, because one thing I see religions doing, and this has come out in my discussions with Paul van der Klee, is they represent a distributed cognitive memory of encounters with the sacred, right? And that it doesn't belong to any one person precisely. That was the whole idea of the ecclesia, the body of Christ, right? It's a distributed thing across time. And John Karst really talks about this a lot in his book, The Religious Case Against Belief, where he said, we've lost that sense of, what you actually have. You have like this, I don't know what to call it. It's this sort of structure that keeps forming around mystery, and it sort of carries it forward, and that's how it's remembered. And then we're losing that as we're trying to solidify and still it into sets of beliefs. But the point I'm trying to make is that the church is, I'm using the church as a categorical thing. I don't mean like the Roman Catholic Church, right? It seems to me that one of the places in which you get a clear instance of where cultures have tried to maintain that distributed collective memory of the encounter with the uncanny, or what I might call the sacred, right? And to try and continually bridge between the cognitive, the existential, and the ontological has precisely been in religions. Religions, in fact, seem to be where you get that kind of not only distributed synchronically across people, but diachronically across time. This is the whole religious idea of tradition, right? Tradition seems to be that kind of thing you're talking about. Or am I making a mistake? So I'm opening it up. No, yeah.
The tradition, yes. It's and the trouble is, Heidegger has one of the essays that's not very well known by Heidegger is on traditional language and technical language, and it happens for Heidegger greatly in language. We speak more and more in terms that are very technical and no longer connected to the sense of poiesis. And poiesis, of course, is connected to the sacred, because the sacred means I would think means something that you simply to let something occur, to let something be, let something shine in and of itself, and not want it to be in sheer available actuality, for example. And about Otto, there's a friend of mine, Francesco Cataneo, just published a book on Otto and Nietzsche in Italian, which is La presenza degli dei, the presence of the gods.
Right, right.
And for Otto, there is this sheer presence of the divine in beings. And I'm not sure. So with Heidegger, I think it's a bit different, because for him, the gods remain unnamed. And they remain withdrawn a bit to a certain degree. And I think what he's trying to do, at least on my reading, I'm not sure if that's correct, what he's trying to do in the fourfold is to remind us, think about when he writes this, 50s and 60s, he gives public talks to engineers, etc. And he tells, at a time when there was a great belief that technology could save us, liberate us, once and for all, we could have utopia. And Adorno at the time, and Ernst Bloch talked about how utopia would come about when we finally give up on death, right? So once we become immortal, that's when we have utopia, or when death becomes an option for those who want to die for whatever reason. But in that time, I think he reminds the human being of a simple truth, of this capacity of being mortal. And that capacity is only, however, possible to even think of when there are immortals. For Heidegger, you can never think one without the other, right? There's so uncanny in German means unheimlich, unhomely. So the world is unhomely, but it can also be homely. And it's all
exactly it. That's what I wanted to get to.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that Chris and I have thought about is that the sacred seems to be doing both of these. It seems to both be a way of homing us against horror. This is Geertz's notion, right, of the sacred, while at the same time also at times, as you say, unhoming us, putting us outside of that sense, and it mediates between. Okay, go ahead.
No, this is super, because one of the things I've been thinking about is horror.
Yeah, exactly. I have too. Yeah.
Horror is so important, because the way we think of horror is, I mean, just in everyday terms, horror is a movie.
Yeah.
Horror is something in a film that's horrible for 2 hours, and then I go home and maybe I have a bad dream. But no, horror. And the weird thing is what happens, again, thanks to Immanuel Kant, or maybe not thanks to him, how does he define boredom? He calls boredom the horror vacui, the horror of emptiness, which is that perhaps a ride in the horse cart is rather dull, right? So this is incredibly bourgeois, a definition of horror, but that to him is horror vacui. But he's almost like, because the noumenal, what's the noumenon, the unnamed, that's what it means. So what Kant is doing, he's pushing even the essence of things all the way to an unnamed outside, to a realm of uncanny, maybe to a realm of sheer horror, to H.P. Lovecraft. You could think of him, for example, here. But when you think of this in terms of Heidegger, again, in terms of the history of metaphysics forgets concealment. Metaphysics forgets self-withdrawal. Maybe metaphysics also forgets horror. Maybe this history forgets this sheer horror that also is at the heart of existence. Not only, but also.
Well, that gives me two connecting points. Is the way to circle back to mortality, the way Eastern or Asiatic religions, I'm thinking, especially, of Indian and Chinese, especially Buddhist, but how there's the horror of immortality.
Yeah.
Right. Which so when I talk to people in the West about this, and I say, I try to get them to understand this idea about how important your mortality is. Well, no, but they'll say as if it's axiomatic, but we all just want to live forever. And I say, well, actually you don't, and that's not true of other cultures, right? Other cultures actually experience the prospect of immortality as deeply, deeply horrific. and reincarnation, for example, is the thing you're trying to break free from in many versions of Hinduism, and of course, and the same thing with sort of the desire for perpetual existence is what binds you into suffering within Buddhism in profound ways. And so, I think what the connection I'm trying to bring it back to is, I think the absence of horror in our metaphysics is actually a telling thing. I think it again points to the fact that we are ultimately seeking a kind of security for our intelligibility rather than always trying to nourish our intelligibility through awe. And I think those are fundamentally different projects for us.
Yeah, totally. And that's the security, I think. And this is where I think what the response to, as Heidegger would say, the withdrawal of being through the withdrawal of sense, right? And one of the things I liked in that interview with your teacher, where he was talking about the our response, right, is to the withdrawal of sense is to take this hypermorality position, right?
That's a great insight.
Right? Where we go, we experience the loss of sense, but we don't recognize. We compensate for it by just being really upset about things, right, and being offended about things. And what's interesting is you can notice that like rationality doesn't even consider rationality. No. And that response to the withdrawal of the sense of beingness, of the fullness of things.
Well, we've excluded from our notion of rationality any sense of this whole side of the spectrum, if I could put it that way. Rationality has been truncated to confirmation, coherence, the idea that insight and transformation and a capacity for wonder in Plato's sense, not Aristotle's sense, because I think for Aristotle it's more like curiosity. For Plato, it's clearly awe. That all of these things are actually crucial to, for example, overcoming all of the self-deception that our egocentrism and our narcissism makes us prey to. And they should therefore be central to our ideas of rationality, not peripheral things that are somehow romantically pursued when our rationality is done what it needs to do for the day. I think that is a very crucial point, what you just did, Guy, to try and the way in which we're talking again, we're talking about something ontological, and then we shift into the existential, and then it reverberates back into the cognitive. Now, because now we're bringing up the whole notion of what does rationality, because if this is about sense making, rationality should be in this discussion, but obviously in a reformulated way so that it comports with what we're talking about.
Well, and I think one of the things that if I feel into it, like I think one of the things I like about what I've gotten out of reading Heidegger, more than his ideas or his views, and it's been to read him is to walk on the path of looking to that which reveals its uncanniness, right?
I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah. It's almost like it's been a practice for me.
Well, totally. But I have found that to be the case. And I think Heidegger would actually like me saying this. So there's maybe a bit of a performative pun here. I found that to be the case with all of the really great philosophers. Like I find you don't read Spinoza.
Yeah.
You I don't know what, you immerse yourself in Spinoza until like I'm going to use this word because I think it's appropriate. You have to read Spinoza. You have to recite Spinoza to yourself religiously. You have to go through. Like if you don't get scientia intuitiva when you're reading, if it doesn't occur to you, then all you've got is the arguments of Spinoza. I think you've missed the ethics. You've missed the ethics. Yeah. Same thing with Plato, right? Plato is sacred to me because I can keep following Plato. I can go to Plato. I get insight. I get the challenge to transformation. I go out into the world, The world discloses itself to me in a way that it couldn't before. That transforms me. I go back to Plato, and then I see something again in Plato that I didn't see. And so Plato engenders anagoge. Spinoza engenders scientia intuitiva. I think the great philosophers engender, again, a state that's between or beyond the cognitive, the existential, and the ontological. They put you into this place, I'm struggling for words here, that isn't captured by those categories. And that's the thing of any great philosopher, is to get to that place with them.
Right. And I'm
wondering, do you think I'm right? Do you think Heidegger would like that? Sorry, Guy, I don't need to interrupt you, but do you think he would like that reading of the great philosophers?
Yeah, I think what you're describing is what you could call the apparition of thinking, right? This sudden bursts in.
Yes.
And there's nothing, and this is what I thought philosophy would be.
Yes.
In academia, and it was a bit like that with Ivo Di Gennaro in Italy, but it's because it's a very small university, and I came here and it was a bit different. But I think that's ultimately how philosophy should be taught, right? I don't care, is it this ism or that ism? That's not ultimately that important. It's not that important why you might disagree with Plato on some things or others, but what is it why is it that we read these texts in the way we do, and what is it that they do with us, and why is it that we can come back to them again and again and again, and must actually. I've read the cave allegory I don't know how many times.
Exactly.
And still I'm reading it. I could read it every week and I would still, oh right, I forgot, oh really, this is in there too, every single time.
Yes.
Yeah, Guy, back to you, because I cut you off. I'm sorry about that. I just wanted
to... just wondering if we look at, I think I really want to I think this is exciting because it's drawing, I think it may be bringing something together. If we look at what is it that happens in that relationship of reading a philosopher, right? Like, what are we exercising? And I'm wondering if it touches in on the ontological, like the cognitive and the existential, these three things.
I think so. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. And then for me, and of course you probably foresaw that I was going to do this, Guy. This then translates also into dialogos as something that's happening between people that also has that. And so there's something, right? And it's no coincidence that, Plato writes dialogues, right? That it's not a coincidence. That is not a coincidence. There's something about what we're doing here and how you should read a philosopher. They need each other. This is what I mean about this is a deep meaning of what I'm trying to work on with you, Guy, about trying to bring philosophia, not academic philosophy, but philosophia into circling, and to get the two of them, working together. So that, what's happening in the circling feeds into reading the philosophers, and reading the philosophers feeds back into that. That's the project I'm on right now.
I'm with you. I'm with you. Right. Thus all the texts I send you.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to respond to the last one you gave me. I'm sorry. It was very good, by the way. It was very good, by the way.
So I think the thing about, well, it's actually like bringing in the conversation that you had with Andrew, what I was writing with you about.
The second conversation, you mean? Second
conversation. I really, really got at a deeper level this sense of what was it? How rationality is rationing for where to bring your attention that reveals wisdom, right?
Yeah, the rationing and the ratio, the proportioning, that it has as much to do with logistics as it does to do with logic.
Yeah.
And the proportioning isn't like just it isn't just an intellectual proportioning. It's like in the fourfold, the correct proportioning of human beings to the gods and to the earth. That's ratio, right? That's ratio,
right?
Because it's much closer, like I say, to logos, and all that was, the best word from another culture is dharma. Dharma is a word, like in Buddhism, that has all of that kind of sense to it, right?
Yeah. And I just really got that sense of oh, that there's a way of listening, right? That there's a way, and it seems like listening seems to be the right metaphor here, right?
I like hearkening better. I like your hearkening better because for me, hearkening carries with it the sense of also a receptivity and making oneself sensitive, almost vulnerable and opening. In that listening doesn't connote that for me the way hearkening does, because hearkening, like it's a bit, hearken is a call to you, right?
You're listening to the call, and that there's something about it where I think this starts to be break free of the metaphysics, right? Because it to hear is to be unclear about what you're hearing, but yet to be attuned to what you can't quite make out yet, right? That would be whispering to you, and to be, or because this is one of the things I noticed in circling and leading circling, of just, I noticed this last weekend, is just sitting with people and hearkening to what's really present, and just tuning into that. Is I kept feeling this sense of, and this growing sense of tuning in to the movement of showing, or something like there's an orientation that just keeps drawing it. It has an auto-poetic quality to it.
It does.
Yet it's not an object. It's not looking for an object or an answer.
No.
It's something else, just at the edge of intelligibility, or the.
It reminds me. When I was circling last night, so I said I want to follow the circle where it goes, but I was invoking Socrates as a point of follow the argument wherever it goes. That's that kind of sense.
Yeah.
I want to hear what Johannes has to say, but I want to ask you one question, Guy, first.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes to the point we were just on. I don't quite want to leave it yet, because I sort of brought this up, like sort of post-circling, and I was saying, we're hearkening to each other, and we're even hearkening, to the third factor that's opening between us. But it seems to me there's another, like I said, I have an allegiance to you, the people I'm circling with, and I have allegiance to the process, but I also want to be able to, I think this is part of being authentically participating in it. I want to be able to engage my allegiance to the topics that might emerge.
Yes.
So, for example, one person sort of brought the circling practice itself into question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And what happened is people just did the circling and they sort of tuned into each other. And I was kind of like, no, I didn't, no. That's a lost opportunity. We should keep the circle going, but that person wants to wonder about circling rather than just wonder within circling. And those aren't the same thing. And they should be put into dialogue with each other. And, what does that mean? Like, to step back and and then what happened is we then started this discourse around circling, which, that's what I mean about, again, trying to get these things to talk to each other. Yes. We should both let Johannes say something, though. He's been very patient and kind with us.
Don't worry. Thanks. Just briefly on hearkening, I had not thought of this. I'd always just, use the word to listen to. I will from now on say hearken, because it's also much closer to horchen in German. Horch, right, which is listen, but hearken in a proper. You have to now really hear what I'm saying.
Yes.
And what we now think of as what we've classified as the first fragment of Heraclitus, if it actually was his first fragment, we don't know. He speaks of akouein, so he speaks of the logos, and that we already are in a hearing stance to the logos.
Yeah.
But we're not listening, or now I would say hearkening.
Yes.
So this is one of the oldest wisdoms that we have, or testimonials of logos, is that logos can be hearkened. There's always a hearing. That's always something addressing us, calling us.
Yes.
But what we must do is respond. We must respond, and that's ultimately beautifully in English to say this, because you can say that's responsibility.
Yes.
There is this deep sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
It mustn't be cut off from, and that has to do ultimately, I think, with the ecstatic temporality of history itself. That's something that I see in circling happening, because it works with what has been comes back towards you all the time, right? This is all the time, and I think this is how history ultimately works itself. And what we've done is we've made linear history, and assume that we just move on into an empty field that we can at will rearrange and make it just our own wherever we please. And we've completely forgotten that which has been is still coming back, and maybe not just to haunt us, but also to give us again a sense of direction.